everyone to the, I guess, first installment this semester of the Center for Historical Research. And this, again, is a 2-year program on family, household, and kinship. Not kinship. It is my pleasure and my honor to, first of all, before I introduce the speaker, I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. If everyone could please write their name on it, so just so we get a ballpark sense of attendance, that would be wonderful. Back when we were discussing our program 3 years ago now, Jane Hathaway and I were very animated about the idea of inviting today's speaker, Jan DeVries. He, among other things, in addition to being one of the foremost, if not the foremost, economic historian of early modern Europe, to being an expert and really sort of pathbreaker on the history of urbanism in the early modern world, and on the origins of the market economy, and so on. He wrote a book that many of us have found to be insightful and interesting and controversial. That is the book, The Industrious Revolution, which is about the role of the household in the early modern economy. And Jane and I were very interested in having him come precisely so we could have someone who comes at the questions of domestic life, the family, from a different perspective, and who, more to the point, is a trained economic historian, and so asks questions and gives answers in some ways very differently than a lot of us do who think more along the lines of social and cultural history. So today he's going to speak to us on a topic that's not directly related to his book, in fact, but I know what he can do and always can do if you've read his work is to draw connections between macro level developments and the micro. And I know in the Q&A, I hope we all can engage him on questions that connect with some of the other things we've been doing. So that's my general introduction. Let me give some specifics. Jan DeVries is the Ehrman Professor Emeritus of History at the University of California at Berkeley. He was educated at Columbia and then at Yale. I found out today he was a classmate of Dale Van Cleest at Yale, which I did not know. He has won numerous major awards, including the Guggenheim. He is also a recipient of the Heineken Prize. Is Jeffrey in the room yet? Jeffrey's we have 2 Heineken Prize recipients in the same room here in Little Columbus, Ohio. 2 of his books, not just one, but 2 of his books won the Gregory Ronke Prize in European economic history. The Industrious Revolution was one of those books. I could only find a CV for you, Jan, from 2012, at which point you had 8 pages of invited talks, 5 pages of articles. So I'm not even, you get the picture. He's edited 3 books and authored 5 books alone and one with A.M. van der Voorde. Did I pronounce that correctly? Voorde, thank you. And he is again, a major figure in the economic history of early modern Europe, and particularly on the Netherlands in the 17th and 18th centuries. So without further ado, he's going to speak to us today on The General Crisis is Dead, Long Live the Little Divergence. Please welcome Jan DeVries.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And before I say anything further, you might hear from my voice it's a little deeper than it normally is, and I hope I don't lose my voice in the course of this talk today, but I well lubricated here with water. I'm assured that it's water.
It's not vodka.
But I hope everything will be fine. And I also want to thank you for coming here today, particularly today, for this talk. I was going to say it speaks to your dedication to the profession of history, but perhaps it speaks to our common desire to be anywhere except in front of the television set. At any rate, we'll get through this together. Now, to my talk today. It's true I'm not going to talk about households except perhaps at the very end of my talk. I hope it'll be clear why that micro level concept how that micro level concept should be integrated to the macro level issues that I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about today. And I want to begin with a discussion of periodization. This talk's going to be much of it at a very high and perhaps kind of elementary level. I want to talk about these concepts of general crisis and of little divergence. Now, the discipline of history has invested a great deal in the identification and the description and the analysis of, well, let's call them moments of change. We like to talk about turning points, revolutions, crises, or more modestly, periods of transition. And these markers organized historical chronology into periods, they're the basis of periodization. And for better or worse, this is the foundation of history as a professional discipline. This is how we reproduce ourselves. When we train graduate students, they go into job markets that are defined by these periods. And so while they might be guidance for raising historical questions, they can also be very confining. They can be something like a straitjacket. And in European history, there's no established period, I think, has a larger stake in those watersheds, in those turning points, and how we think about them, than the early modern period. Any conceivable alteration of those signposts, those turning points, will still leave us with a need for medievalists and modernists. But we can't be so sanguine about early modernists. Indeed, early modern history is the latecomer to the schema of periodization the periodization of European history. It became common usage only after the mid-20th century. Before that, and indeed even now, these centuries are better known, or are primarily known, by identifiers that are drawn from various national historical traditions, and most generally by the concepts of Renaissance and Reformation, of Enlightenment and Revolution. If we want to define and defend the periodization of early modern history, we generally appeal to the watershed qualities of the terms that I just mentioned. Now, it must be admitted that none of these concepts are as self-evidently the turning points that they were once thought to be. As most historians have moved toward a smaller scale, toward a more micro level of historical investigation, and as many have developed an abiding suspicion of master narratives of all sorts, the watersheds and the turning points that supplied the dramatic organization of European history has suffered an erosion of historians' allegiance to their essential planes. I've listed here a number of works, a bit arbitrarily, one could mention others, of works that, at least to my knowledge, offer a sort of a critique or a lament about the lost relevance or the lost salience or the lost power of these concepts. They stand now as a kind of hollow pillars holding up a temple where historians still congregate, but where they no longer worship. And compounding the structural deficiencies of this temple, and to stick with my metaphor just a moment longer, is the fact that they're two temples, badly connected. The early modern era remains dependent on its predecessor organizing concepts of Renaissance and Reformation on the one hand to the early 17th century, and of Enlightenment and Revolution, or the Ancien Régime, for some point from the second half of the 17th century onward. So there are two early modern periods separated by a kind of no man's land. At least in my own history department at Berkeley, I'm the only member who, as long as I've been there, has taught courses that span this period. unless you're teaching a Western Civ course or something, but if you're teaching a more specialized course, usually you're dealing with this, a long 16th century, or you're dealing with a kind of long 18th century. And in the history of science, in economic history, I think there are some exceptions here, but otherwise, it's not only that these two periods are, these two sub-periods, we might call them, are badly connected, but they're badly connected by design, because it's rarely the same historian who teaches and does research across that line. And that's, I think, the main point I'm trying to make here. Now, two fairly recent developments in early modern European history, I think, speak to the point that I'm trying to make. In the history of the Reformation, the concept of confessionalization has been the focus of much research over the past 25 years. It tends to extend the Reformation studies forward into the 17th century, up to, say, 1648, 1650 as a round number. And in the history of the Enlightenment, the work of Jonathan Israel on an early or radical Enlightenment has, as it were, looked for its origins and pushes it back to the mid-17th century. But it's as though the one ends, the other begins, but there's no one feels any obligation to connect them, right? To show how the one leads to the other, or prepares for the other, or what happened, what great cataclysm happened that links them. So they are kind of sort of two solitudes, right, that abut each other without any connection. Now, well, this brings me to the general crisis of the 17th century. Presumably, it does or should connect them. As a historical watershed goes, as a turning point, the general crisis of the 17th century is a newcomer, just as the term early modern. And its problem is, in a sense, the opposite of that faced by the more venerable markers that I've just been discussing. The established historiographical concepts around which Western European, history has long been organized suffers perhaps from being too familiar. Historians have lost their ability to believe in the dramatic organization that they impart on the historical narrative. Their familiarity may breed contempt or at least indifference. The problem with the concept of the general crisis, in a way, is the opposite. Historians don't know or have never been able to agree on just what it is. They await some sort of resolution. There's a space left for it to be filled at some future date. Now, since the 1950s, when this concept was first mooted, the intellectual climate in the recent decades has really not been hospitable to making progress on this kind of a project. More than other historical concepts, the general crisis requires a theoretical explanation. So the Reformation or the Age of Revolution, etc., all the others I've mentioned, have been theorized, of course, but historians could and still can study them as concrete historical phenomena. They can write a narrative of the events that constitute the phenomenon in question. Now, debates can arise about the most relevant events to include or to exclude. Theoretical models can make a difference in such a debate, but historical interpretation relies primarily on the experiences of contemporaries and interpreting what they said they were doing and what they thought was happening. The general crisis of the 17th century, more than most historical concepts, is based on theory. It starts from theory rather than, you might say, leading to theoretical reflection. Its various theorists all suppose that there was something guiding and challenging the actors, the historical actors, that few, if any of them, could fully comprehend. Thus, the crisis does not emerge directly from the testimony of contemporaries, or stronger still, the conventional historical testimony is likely to mislead, to reflecting as it does the puzzlement or the partial understanding of most contemporaries. So it's the historian's task to cast that evidence into a theoretical framework. Jonathan DeWalt wrote an essay on the crisis in a collection, in a sort of a, what is it called, a forum in the American Historical Review of, I think, 2008. Jeffrey had a piece in there too. He put it this way: the concept of the 17th century crisis has endured less because of what it says about specific events in the early modern period than as an effort to understand European modernity, economic, political, and cultural. Well, that, in a way, his statement, what I've just quoted, kind of lets the cat out of the bag. One can phrase it in several ways, but the central claim of the crisis concept is that true modernity, or some decisive breakthrough toward this modernity, emerges then, and by implication, if not explicitly, not in the earlier periods, time of the Reformation or the Age of Discoveries, not later with the political and economic revolutions of the 18th century. So if that claim has any validity, an exploration of this period that our discipline has conspired to leave as a kind of a black box or a space to be filled, it deserves more attention than it has received. But that's not to say that it has been altogether neglected. There is, of course, important literature. I won't spend too much time on that, but I want to say a few things about, you might say, the state of this field and what's right and wrong with it. We can begin with what I'll call the first generation crisis literature, which, at least in my vision, can be organized into two broad categories: an economic crisis and a political crisis. Now, they're related. The economic crisis has political consequences, interactions. The political crisis has economic factors that play a role in it, and of course cultural factors as well. But the economic crisis starts from the basic patterns of prices, of wages, of population trends, and the available foreign trade data we have for the 16th, early 17th centuries that identifies the end of this long 16th century expansion of the price inflation, of the price revolution in the first decades of the 17th century. The regional variations in this across Europe were substantial, but still a pan-European pattern could be constructed of stagnation and decline in many of these indicators in the first half of the 17th century. But moving beyond description to explanation proved to be particularly difficult. So we have demographic and monetarist arguments that I think, without going into detail, seem inadequate to fully explain what was occurring. By far the most influential effort to interpret those events comprehensively was the essay by Eric Hobsbawm in his 1954 Past and Present, his articles in Past and Present. In his hands, the general crisis was nothing less than the transition from feudalism to capitalism, as foretold by the prophet Marx. So earlier harbingers of capitalist economic organization in Europe had, he claimed, long been blocked from some full development, some full realization of their historical mission. The feudal social structures and political power still remained too powerful. In material terms, he argued, and I think today hardly anyone would agree with him, but he argued then, nothing stood in the way of proceeding straight from the capitalists of Renaissance Italy to the Industrial Revolution. But, oops.
Better you than us.
Better get rid of this thing. Try to keep track of the time here. I don't see your clock. Anyway, so he argued that nothing stood in the way of, from a technological point of view, from the development of, the achievements of the Industrial Revolution. What stood in the way were socio-political obstacles. But the crisis of the early 17th century, which manifested itself in those quantitative trends that I just alluded to, itself created the conditions which were to make that breakthrough, and hence the Industrial Revolution, possible. So we're talking about a kind of dialectical process here. Not of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but of crisis, response, and resolution. But who is it who succeeds in this struggle among states? His vision was very much focused on trade. It was very much focused on the exercise of, let's say, state power in the economic sphere, in a kind of mercantilist atmosphere of the 17th century. He argued that a concentration of power or control over trade in certain places was needed to provide what he called a forced draft of demand for the creation of the factory system. This was perhaps, at least in my mind, though despite all the things I disagree with him about, and I don't follow the Marxist argument here, but this to me was the one area of real insight, of demand, that this was a society that had trouble, as it were, generating demand for goods, and it would stimulate innovation and organizational change. And so a forced draft of demand, a kind of artificial concentration of the demand that did exist in a few favored places, as a bellows forcing oxygen into a strategic place in the fire in order to a fireplace in order to speed combustion. That was an interesting idea. Here's how you could see how a crisis might create a resolution, right? And as it were, lead to the next phase. A problem was in understanding, well, just who was it who was strong, or who was capable, or who benefits from this? Why one state over another? Why Northwestern Europe, as it happens, rather than Spain and Portugal or other nations that had vast colonial empires and access to vast trading opportunities? And in a way, this is how things have been left since he wrote on the economic side of this story. The political crisis literature is more extended and varied, but it finds its origins in an effort to link, through comparative study, the contemporaneous revolutions of the mid-17th century, as first identified by Merriman in 1938. The link that proved most persuasive was state building, that some kind of state building process of Renaissance monarchs, of absolutist monarchs, that this long-term process, to be found in many European states, stood behind these crises. This involves an extension, this state building process involves an extension of the tendrils of the state deeper and more extensively into society than they had ever gone before, in order to control religion, to harness regional elites, to suppress the autonomy of towns, to professionalize the military, to gain access to a broader tax base. And then the economic contraction of the early 17th century, you might say, raises the stakes further, creates a tension because of the pressure that this political agenda places on the material reality, the deteriorating material reality of these societies. And that brings resistance to this process, the resistance of an unusual power, threatening state breakdown in country after country. Now, the details of this process varied from place to place, but revealed a common underlying pattern. And Hugh Trevor Roper, in his famous essay, applies this to the English Civil Wars and to the English situation. Many other writers, Niels Steenskaart, the Danish historian, had a more comparative, comprehensive European and eventually Eurasian view of this phenomenon. But a real problem remains, which is that this literature was good in describing the onset of the crisis, but not very good at the outcome. The political crises were resolved country by country, leading to what's variously described as exhaustion, a calm after the storm, stability, pacification. As with housebound economic crisis, resolution brought winners and losers, states that modernized, those that consolidated their old bad habits. But this parting of the waters remains, you might say, the stuff of traditional history. Different events lead to different outcomes. So the crisis, you might say, is good at talking about the crisis, but not about the resolution to the crisis. The second generation of this literature, see, we're not the first here, this is the second. If the first generation addressed a problem in European history, the second pioneers the extension of that concept to what we now call global history. Indeed, many of them extended the term early modern from a period of European history to a distinct epoch of global, at least of Eurasian history. The whole world now shared distinctive early modern conditions and together experienced a 17th century crisis. And the essential move to turn the crisis from a European to a global phenomenon was to identify a global force as the chief catalyst of the economic and political disturbances that we've been discussing, which then would lead to religious and cultural issues that otherwise would appear to require local explanation. Now, demography could fill this role if a global force stood behind demographic change. Could the whole world have experienced a kind of Malthusian crisis of overpopulation simultaneously? If not, that seems too far-fetched. Then the introduction of, say, a new disease vectors that shifted mortality upward, sort of in almost all societies in a contemporaneous way in the first half of the 17th century. That could play this role. Well, that's the ground chosen by Jack Goldstone in his book Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. He based his vision of a worldwide 17th century crisis of agrarian absolutist states that affected both Eastern empires and Western monarchies. He based that on the existence of a global demographic contraction. And I was trying to make a little schema of his model. And it turns out that it's a little more difficult than I thought it would be. So his model isn't quite as rigorous as you would expect a trained sociologist, I think, to produce. But it basically boils down to this. On the one hand, there was population growth that is confronting inflexible economic structures that generates inflation, falls in per capita income, so economic problems of all sorts. And simultaneously, there's a state-building process that we just talked about, higher, more invasive taxation and regulation, and these are coming together, going to create kind of a crisis. But then, out of the blue, as it were, there's an exogenous mortality-induced crisis that intensifies all of this, which leads to inter-elite conflict, the state breakdown. This gets the masses stirred up, there's popular unrest, ideological challenges to the regime as people are trying to develop some cosmological view of just what's going on here and who is evil and who is good, and then ultimately some sort of resolution. So I think that is how we can describe his, I say, global 17th century crisis concept. An alternative to this demographic model replaces an autonomous change in disease vectors with an autonomous change in climate. And here's where your colleague and my friend Jeffrey Parker, we can both have a glass of Heineken sometime. So, bond. This is where Jeffrey's magnum opus, the global crisis, comes into the picture. And I'm not going to say too much about his works, since I presume most of you all of you should be familiar with it. The common factor across 17th century Eurasia, and indeed the globe, is a cooling of atmospheric temperature and an increased variance in annual climate conditions. Climate becomes not only more severe in general, but more unpredictable in particular, year by year. This less benign environment stands behind a global population collapse comparable, in Jeffrey's view, to the Black Death, which in conjunction with other factors leads not just to 6 contemporaneous European crises, but 50 contemporaneous Eurasian crises. Now, the spheres of commerce, of trade, of industry and agriculture, the sort of things that, say, Hobsbawm's approach might have focused on, these play a subsidiary role in the story, presumably because their power is judged to be small in the face of climate, environment, and war-making states of these enormously powerful forces, which, as Jeffrey sees it, lock in themselves into a kind of fatal synergy that sweeps all before it. But even here, a kind of dialectic is at work. Somehow, and I quote him now, out of this global catastrophe emerges the Great Divergence that has shaped world history up to our time. Oops. The three big claims, then, of this work, as I understand it, is the Little Ice Age is the catalyst of the crisis. There are all sorts of things going on, but what makes this a real crisis, a global crisis, and a very severe one, is this injection of an autonomous force. A vast European demographic collapse is the embodiment of the crisis. That's sort of how we see it, observe it as historians. And then the quote that I just cited, which is, might say, that implicit promise of the general crisis as a historical category. This is the origin of something big, right? This is the origin of what we've come to be familiar with in recent historical literature, of a great divergence that has shaped the world up to our time. Origins of a kind of modernity, or of a modern condition. Now, the first two of his claims, I think, in principle, we could test, or they're verifiable claims that we could investigate more carefully if we had any question about their validity. The third claim remains something of in my view, still something of a black box. I still struggle with this. It's a problem in nearly all the work of the general crisis that is more convincing in presenting the crisis than in explaining the resolution. Yet, this is critical to the crisis as a historical concept. If it's going to succeed, it has to succeed here. We can describe the crisis convincingly, but we have to account for the resolution, account for, as it were, what it does for the unfolding of the historical story. And I want to set this problem aside for a moment, explaining the resolution to the crisis, in order to turn to this more recent historiographical innovation that also promises to account for the origins of modern times, the origins of our modern condition, which is this concept of the Great Divergence. Now, as we just noted, Jeffrey sought to link it to the 17th century crisis, but the Great Divergence practitioners, the interpreters who have launched and defended and elaborated on this over the past 15 years, there's R. Bin Wang, there's Ken Pomerantz, Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, and a lot of other people. They don't agree with that. Their claim, in fact, I'll boil it down to their claims to a catechism. If you believe these things, you will be saved, you might say. At least you will be a Great Divergence historian. The most advanced economic zones of Asia fell behind the most advanced economic zones of Europe only at the end of the 18th century. So, in other words, no divergence, important, consequential, lasting divergence before then. We'll turn to what we mean by divergence in a few moments. The Great Divergence has shallow historical roots. And here to quote Peter Perdue, who was, sort of you might say, reviewing as a Chinese historian of China, is reviewing this literature. He says, he characterizes it as a late, rapid, unexpected outcome of a fortuitous combination of circumstances in the late 18th century. So, this Great Divergence is late. The Great Divergence is, you might say, in a sense, accidental, fortuitous, shallow historical roots. And finally, that fortuitous circumstance, those fortuitous circumstances could be identified. They were, in short, coal and colonies, energy and the resources of conquered external territories. Only these factors allowed for a lucky, that is fortuitous, accidental, a lucky escape from otherwise binding environmental constraints. Again, the way Perdue put this, and this was the title of his review of Pomerantz's book, was Lucky England, or Europe, I've forgotten now which, normal China. That is, the normal pattern is what we find in Chinese or more generally Asian history. These are societies that struggle with this, the environmental, you might think of Malthusian forces. One area, England, Northwest Europe, at a very late date for rather accidental reasons, was sort of lifted out of that binding constraint, was exempted from it. And today, and the implication is, easy come, easy go. This too will pass. It won't be long before normal relations will return, and the exceptional conditions of the West, led by Northwestern Europe at the end of the 18th century, is a transitory, relatively fleeting phenomenon. Well, that's to load the Great Divergence concept perhaps a little heavily with interpretations of future unfolding events, but nonetheless, this seems to me to be implicit, certainly implicit within it. Now, the general crisis concept seems to locate the onset of modernity squarely in the center of the early modern era, and while its recent expressions assume a global reach, the analysis on which this claim is based is firmly rooted in European experience. The Great Divergence proclaims something different. It approaches European experience from a global or an Asian perspective. It normalizes Asia, as it were, and identifies the Industrial Revolution as something of an aberration. Again, to quote Jonathan DeWalt in that essay in the American Historical Review, from this vantage point, the one I just described, of the Great Divergence, the crisis of the 17th century loses most of its significance as a social historical event. Who cares what's going on in this corner of Europe when, in fact, this is all sort of embroidery on a changeless tale that is broken up only at the time of the Great Divergence, 150 or 200 years later. So the Great Divergence leaves no space for more than local importance for a general crisis of the 17th century, but the claims of this, sometimes the Great Divergence theorists are called the California school, their claims lend themselves to quantification. That is, if they speak of equivalence between Asian and European economies until the end of the 18th century, economic equivalence, they were different in details in a multitude of ways, but they were equivalent in terms of economic performance and efficiency, then we should be able to measure that. This wasn't something that Pomerantz or Benoit or most of the other writers ever really tried to do. They engaged in a kind of comparative history that was exemplary, that they would find examples, they would make comparisons of specific areas to sharpen their point, but an overall sort of quantification of economic performance from an economist, as an economist would approach it, was never part of their agenda. Now, this has led, then, in the past 15 years to what I would call the quantitative Great Divergence literature. I've listed here the names of a number of people. Most of them are economists by training, but some are historians who have worked on this. I'll return to some of their findings in a minute. They've approached this subject through one of two ways. Either they said, well, look, we have a lot of European data about wages and prices. Why don't we use this in a systematic, comparative way? Rather than just be concerned with how real wages in a given society have changed over time, let's say English real wages across the centuries, which there's a great literature. Why don't we focus on how we can compare the purchasing power of wages across societies, across European societies, but also try to extend that to non-European societies by collecting data of wages and prices in the Ottoman Empire, in South Asia, and in China, and in Japan. So we're looking at real wages. The second, more ambitious approach is to say, well, that's all well and good, but wages aren't everything, and besides, in making these comparisons in many societies, particularly in Asia, wage labor wasn't so abundant, it wasn't a characteristic form of earning a living. What's more important is production, peasant production, artisanal production. And so we want to get a more comprehensive view of the total output of society, and the most comprehensive such view, or such measurement, would be a gross domestic product measurements, which we're familiar with in the study of contemporary economy. So we're extending this familiar tool for modern economies back into the pre-modern or early modern period. Well, so the old challenge was to compare purchasing power over time. The new challenge is to compare it across space. And it is a challenge. I don't have time now to go into the details of just number one, why it is a challenge or how we can overcome it. I'll just say that Robert Allen has done what I call heroic work, not always convincing, but heroic work, to tackle those problems in a systematic way. He expresses his findings in very long time periods, so the resolution isn't what most historians would like to see, but we'll turn to that first. Now, this might look like, it's certainly, if you're in the back of the room, a little hard to follow, but the basic pattern is what's important, and I'll just point it out to you in a minute. What he did was to take wages. Now, these are all, this only deals with Europe, so we're right now, but he extends this to Asia. I'll talk about in a moment. But here we have London, Antwerp, Krakow in Poland, Vienna, Valencia in Spain, northern Italy. He has wages, urban wages, in this case it's for craftsmen, so usually construction labor, in all of these countries, and he has price data, which he puts into a kind of a basket of goods. And he asks how many baskets, which would be, say, sufficient for the support of a family in terms of calories, and the basket varies from place to place depending on whether they eat rye or wheat or grain or rice, say in the case of a comparison with Asia, etc. And he makes these adjustments, always keeping the calories the same, but the actual content of the basket can vary from place to place. And he creates what he calls welfare ratios. The ratio of 1 would be you've got just enough to feed your family with this bare bones diet. If it's above 1, you have more than enough. Below 1, less than enough. And he makes these calculations for 50-year periods for these various cities. The data don't always go back to the very beginning. Over a 50-year period from the late Middle Ages to the beginning of the 20th century. The main point here is that until the first half of the 17th century, while these numbers bounce around a bit, the levels are not always exactly the same, they're all in a kind of the same band and they're all deteriorating. That is, purchasing power is falling in the 16th century as population rises and prices rise. But after 1650, there's a divergence. Right? The others, a bunch of them continue to decline until a very late stage in the 19th century, while others don't. They cease their decline. You might say that's not exactly a powerful growth model, but they don't continue to decline. They stabilize, and then of course at the 19th century they rise. Well, which are these? Well, they're London, and in this case Antwerp, and other data shows Amsterdam. They follow the same pattern. Northwestern Europe diverges from the rest. And this quickly came to be called then, because the Great Divergence concept was already in play, the Little Divergence. And within Europe there was a divergence. It is datable in the first half of the 17th century. And with later data, we could show that this downward trend in most of Europe was not so different from the data, which is very, I have to say, very sketchy and incomplete, that we could find for China. In other words, it wasn't Europe and Asia that differed, that had a great divergence. It was Northwest Europe and the rest of Eurasia, including most of Europe. Hence the little divergence, right, as opposed to the great divergence concept. The second approach, now this is more of the same data for laborers. The second approach is to have a more comprehensive measure and to escape some of the difficulties of finding valid wage data for Asian societies. There's been a lot of criticism of the validity of the wage data for China in particular. So the other approach is to measure, as I said, to measure output. One way to do that is to take the position of Malthusians and say, well, there's no point to this, because we know that output couldn't grow very fast, because of the laws of Malthus. And this has been vigorously argued by Gregory Clark. If you're a Malthusian, this is the book to read. This is the book that will say, yes, this explains how the world works. But if you're not a Malthusian, then the neoclassical tradition, where you might say any society with market prices can be studied in this way. We can measure output and assign prices to them and create measures of gross domestic product. Then we have now an extensive literature that I just briefly outlined here of many countries in which we now have gross domestic product data that goes before 1800 into the early modern and in some cases the medieval period. Now, there are all kinds of problems with this approach too, which I'm going to skip for a second. But let me just show you what I'll call the preliminary findings. This is what these efforts currently look like. We're measuring GDP in order to make them comparable. Usually the prices are set in silver. In some cases, these are put in what are called 1990 international dollars, and I won't try to explain that except to say that we're trying to find some constant, something that's not subject to inflation, and that where we can compare currencies across societies. And so they're usually boiled down to their silver content. So here we see northern and central Italian GDP figures. You might say basically stable, tending downward perhaps, but clearly the highest in the late Middle Ages. The data for Holland, these look spectacularly high, but remember we're looking at just the province of Holland within the larger Dutch Republic, so this will exaggerate, you might say, the level of prosperity or gross domestic product per capita in this country, rising rapidly from the late Middle Ages to the 17th century, and then continuing after an interruption to drift upward. And then England, which at a lower level, right, then suddenly, and here again we're at 1650, shoots upward, converging on the Dutch or on Holland's level. Now we can add two observations from Asia. We have the data I just showed you, plus China, and for a shorter period, India. There's in fact a kind of a big gap here where we have data for, I think, the Tang and the Song eras, and then there's a gap, and then in the Ming and the Qing we have data again, and then in the more modern era. But what it shows is that there apparently was a period of great prosperity that is gradually falls with the Mongols and Asians and whatnot, and doesn't really recover and drifts further and further downward into the 19th century. And the Indians are all, data are all very low. well, there's nothing here to suggest the Great Divergence around 1800 if we interpret the Great Divergence claim to be something that we could hope to measure with gross domestic product data. So the results to date, I think, can be summarized as follows. Well, let's skip this. One, there are major obstacles in the way of making direct comparisons, but the available data give no support to the California school. There's a kind of reversal of fortune, certainly, right? But it must have occurred much, much earlier. The effort to compare economies within Europe reveals that little divergence, opening up between Northwest Europe and the rest. And this raises the possibility that much of Europe did develop similarly to Asia, but only one region actually diverged, that Northwest European one. So where should we seek the origins of that little divergence? Now, the first thing I want to say, just call your attention, is that the general crisis literature, as I tried to argue earlier, was, I say, strong on the crisis, but not so strong on the resolution. The little and the great, certainly the little divergence literature is, in a way, only interested in the resolution. They're interested in that divergence. And so for them, the big problem is, well, how do we explain this? What factors lie behind or underneath these very global, right, macro level trends that we've been charting? Now, the old contenders that we're familiar with in early modern European history, that in a way helped define the category of early modern, is to go back to the age of the Reformation, to what today we might prefer to call the origins of globalization, or to really focus on the British Industrial Revolution and its origins. But almost all of that literature now points to deep underlying factors that give rise gradually over time to that British Industrial Revolution. So we're always being pushed backward. The new contenders, and in a way these are sort of replacing these first two in the eyes of modern research, current day researchers in this topic, are the crises of the 14th and 15th centuries. We go right back to the aftermath of the Black Death, of the plague, and our friend, the crisis of the 17th century. I want to pursue this a little bit further by looking carefully at a statement, which is, the summary conclusions of the most impressive and comprehensive study of medieval and early modern gross domestic product that we have to date, and which is a teamwork led by Steve Broadberry in Britain in his book that was just published called British Economic Growth 1270 to 1870. And at the end of this volume, he's sort of summarizing his findings. And he makes the following claims. The transition to modern economic growth, that's what economists mean by the long sort of technology-driven continued economic growth at some rate that we think is occurring since the British Industrial Revolution. This transition did not occur until the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It then spread quickly. So the Industrial Revolution remains protected. It's the origin of modern economic growth. But, then he goes on, there was nothing preordained about this breakthrough, except that it sprang from processes of structural economic change, commercial specialization, and technological innovation, whose origin should be seen as stretching back to the late medieval period, to the immediate post-plague years, is what he has in mind. So you might find this statement to be almost contradictory. He says there's nothing preordained except you could predict it from 1350 onward. That I think is not quite what he means, but the point is he wants to find these origins in a crisis, but not that of the 17th century, but of the 14th century. this period then, was when a small but intrinsically dynamic economies grouped around what he called the southern shores of the North Sea entered a phase of persistent, if not consistent, growth based on productive methods that were capital intensive, energy intensive, human capital intensive. In other words, a new kind of economy was, as it were, coming together in this period. But then he adds one more statement, which I was pleased to read, but it complicates things a bit. Workers respond to this increasing array of goods that become available over time with an industrious revolution. By working longer and harder, households increase their incomes. In due course, they accumulate savings that helps finance the investment of physical human capital that underpins it. This begins in the 17th century. In other words, we're back with our crisis. It's now the origins of the industrious revolution, which is a kind of second phase of a process that he describes as going all the way back to, say, 1350. Now, so I think I've made these points. He illustrates this by summarizing his data, which are, if you can believe it, are annual observations from 1350 to 1870 to 1870, by summarizing the average annual rates of change of English after 1700 becomes British and Scotland GDP in these periods. So here we have the annual rate of growth, or of decline, where there's a negative number, of first of gross domestic product in total, then of population, and then the one divided by the other, gross domestic product per capita. So in the medieval period, very slow growth of output, but it's matched by the growth of population. There's no change in per capita income. Now, in the century after, from 1348, there's, of course, a major decline in total output, but that's because there's an even greater decline of population. So you might say, these two things are racing to the bottom, but they give rise to a net growth of the GDP per capita. The survivors of the plague are better off, and there's all sorts of reasons why we might believe that. There's more land available per head, and certainly from a Malthusian point of view, there's growth. Then, from 1470 to 1650, there's growth of population, a more or less equal growth of gross domestic product, trivial increase in GDP per capita. But from 1650 to 1769, so the eve of the Industrial Revolution, there's a great acceleration of GDP per capita. And after 1770, with the onset of full British industrialization, an even faster growth. So except for this one, I say, rather long interruption, we have from the shock of the Black Death, as Broadberry and his colleagues see it, kind of a step-by-step growth, right, in the improvement in the performance of the English-British economy. Slow at first, faster in the early modern period after 1650, even faster after 1770. I gotta wrap this up, so let me move more quickly. I just want to make one point about this, which is that his own data show that the periods in which he gathered his data for the interpretation that I've just given you, and that is consistent with his statement that we just read, is not right. I mean, it just is inconsistent with his data. I've regrouped the data. Now we have it in a few more periods, but it's all the same data that he presented. It's just been organized in different periods. There was indeed a major increase in GDP per capita after the Black Death, but it occurred immediately. It occurred as a kind of the result of a shock, of a sudden change in the man-land ratio. There was very little change in urbanization, in percentage of the population in working in industry. Structural changes were largely absent, but the survivors of the plague were better off. They had more food to eat, and they ate more food, and the gross domestic product shrank, but population shrank faster, hence there was growth. For the next 100 years, the population continued to drift downward, but so did output, and there was no further growth. In other words, this was not a cumulative process. And of course, for the 15th and 16th and early 17th century, no further growth. Then suddenly another great burst of growth after 1650, hardly credible that it could be this rapid, I must say. And then slower, but still growth in the 17th century. But the Industrial Revolution now is, you can't be distinguished from the earlier periods. There's no acceleration. There's important structural change, presumably, but it doesn't show up in improved gross domestic product. That comes only after 1830 in the 19th century high industrialization era. Now, the point I want to make here is to make a distinction between these two crises. The one was important, but it represented a shift. I'd say you need to push the point a little to the extreme, a kind of once and for all change that occurs within a generation or so in the well-being of the population, mainly without major structural change in the economy. But it's the second of those shifts identified by those same data, and which we can also find in Dutch data for the same period, which I don't have time to go into, and it's not quite as clear-cut, but which I can't go into in great detail now. Between 1650 and 1690, there's this phenomenal growth path that is begun. And so we want to focus on these two. The one is the shift, I'm arguing, and the second is the beginning of real structural change that leads to long-term industrialization. And the best way to summarize that, and then I think that will just about bring me to the end, is to look at these two ways of looking at the economy. Remember I said we could look at it from the point of view of real wages, or we could look at it from the point of view of total output. And our quantitative Great Divergence scholars have been doing both. The dotted line is the gross domestic product, the output line per capita for England. The solid line is the purchasing power of labor, of day wages. In other words, how much can you buy with a day's labor, given the wage and the prices of goods. So we have this odd situation. After 1350, there's this enormous growth in purchasing power. Labor is scarce, wages rise, prices fall because there are fewer people to buy the output of farms in particular. But the total output, while it grows at one-time jump, otherwise remains pretty constant. In other words, people have money, but not goods to buy. What's going on? After 1650, it's just the opposite. There's a great growth of output, but real wages are rising, but they're drifting upward. It's not a dramatic change. Now, the solution to the problem, well, there are two possibilities. One, I think, accounts for the bulk of the difference. The other, I think, is of subsidiary importance. One possibility, let me move on here, is that labor productivity, the wage rate rose, but real incomes didn't really rise. They didn't really rise because there wasn't anything to buy, except for the food. Once you have enough of that, it'd be better to not work than to work for nothing. In other words, people ate more and they played more. That was the main result of the shock of the first crisis. The second crisis, however, is very different and much more complicated and much more interesting. This is our 17th century crisis. It's possible to say that with that great growth of output and the weak growth of the purchasing power of labor, that income inequality rose. Labor's share of that output fell sharply. Profits and rents were rising. Early capitalist accumulation. This would be Hobsbawm's approach, I suppose. But the second, and there could be some of that, but the second approach is, I think, explains most of it. And that's that household incomes rose despite constant real wages as the supply of labor rose. This was the Industrious Revolution. Why would the responses be so different in these two periods? That, I think, goes to the heart of the importance of the crisis of the 17th century. Here we see, I say, the implied working year in England over this long period of time. It falls sharply after the Black Death for the reasons that I explained. It was a perfectly rational response to the situation. But of course, it begins to rise over time, particularly in the 16th century as prices are rising and the purchasing power of labor is falling. But after, say, 1650, it continues to rise. Up to about this point, it's simply restoring the position it had before. If you imagine people had a sort of target income, they wanted a certain basket of goods, mostly foodstuffs. They didn't need to work so hard to achieve that after the Black Death. Over time, they had to work harder and harder to achieve it. But now, after this, somewhere in this period, something is changing. What's changing is that they have their target income. After 1650, prices are tending downward, purchasing power is gently rising, but now they want more. This industrious revolution is interested in a new complex of goods that are available, partly through trade, partly through production, and that is generating a further intensification of labor, and that's standing behind this process of economic growth. Technology after 1770 plays the leading role, but from 1650 until then, it is this industrious revolution. So I said I was wrapping up, and I keep saying that. I'm going to skip over all this. No, I'll go back. Where is the, okay, well, let's just leave it at this. We're making a shift in this period from a society based primarily on coercion to one based on incentives. Or rather, I should say, that's the potential. And the question is, which of the Eurasian societies is capable of making that kind of a change, of reordering its economy and its system of political control, and indeed its ideology or its religious and cultural inheritance in order to motivate behavior more through incentive than through coercion. That's really at the heart of the industrious revolution concept, which goes down to the level of the household in terms of trying to explain it. But at the macro level, we see it in the aggregates of output growth that's based on a great increase in the input of labor. So, the Great Divergence, the general crisis moves then, in my vision, from a primary focus on the struggle among nations for control of trade and colonies, sort of the Hausbaum approach, the forced drafts of demand, to an internal source of demand. To an internal source of demand that is coming primarily through these incentives and the behavior of a multitude of people. Of course, people varied a lot by social class and their particular situation and how they respond to this, whether they did at all. So we're talking about, I might say, some kind of a change in the aggregate that has a lot of variance in it at the level of detail. But that is what is how the crisis was resolved and why it gave rise to this divergence, this little divergence. And I can only conclude by saying more people ought to be studying the central decades of the 17th century. All right, thank you.
Wonderful. We have some time for some questions. So I'm going to let you, Jan, do your own fielding. So please, ask away.
Yeah.
term, I mean, I don't want to delve too deeply into the term, but the term industrial revolution had its origins in Japan.
Yeah.
And I was under the impression that that various people had applied the general framework of households working harder to all of Eurasia in an organic, early modern expansion, secular growth. But yes, Northwest Europe might be pushing a little harder, but maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe Gorski's disciplinary Calvinist revolution is playing a significant role. Maybe there's another model that suggests that broadly across Eurasia, there's a similar kind of Smithian growth.
Yeah.
So then, but you sort of set up the mortality crisis model to suggest that, or the general crisis model, aka Jeffrey Parker and others, Sam White's back here, to suggest that it explains the problem but not the resolution.
Yeah.
And I just wonder about if the Industrial Revolution household effort is common across Eurasia, then what distinguishes?
Okay.
Is the Industrial Revolution, in your model, it seems to be that the hardworking households of Northwest Europe are making the difference. And, well, maybe not.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're not
maybe there's
the only
something else at work.
Yeah, right. So, so to begin with, I stole the Industrial Revolution term from Akira Hayami, the Japanese historian, demographic, economic historian. He understood it as a intensification of labor within the household, in order not to, as it were, to achieve higher consumer aspirations, but really to survive, and to compensate for the lack of a labor market in agriculture. That is, it was the composition of the family that was critical to the operation of the household, and one could bring people into the family, sort of honorary, or I'm not sure what the right word would be from an anthropological point of view, but as kind of as temporary or permanent members. But a flexible labor market was not characteristic of the economy. So it was part of a solution to a particular labor market problem, and part a solution to the growing population of the 17th century, to essentially a Malthusian problem. So he saw it as a means of discipline, as a characteristic of discipline, and in a labor-intensive economy that allowed people to maintain their position, the viability of their household over time, right, over the life cycle of the family, and over multiple generations in a growing land shortage type of society. He and others then said that discipline, that industriousness, that family cohesion, coordination of labor, and focus on the coordination of tasks, then played an important role in the growth in the Meiji and the period in the industrialization of Japan after the 1760s, the 1860s. So this concept has a number of applications. My approach is a little different, and I believe that my industrious households are functioning in a different way, or I say under a different incentive structure than those in the Hayami and the Japanese model. You could say it begins in much the same way. I don't want to make this response too long, but I think I have to lay this out because I think it helps explain what the Industrial Revolution is and what it is not. There's an interesting book by a historian of Britain, Craig Muldrew, who, if I say sort of, he critiques me by saying, well, look, this industriousness goes back to the early 17th century, at least, and we can see it as a part of the Puritan discipline. And indeed, one can see it in the Netherlands as part of Calvinist discipline in in a very similar ideological framework there as well. The end of the 16th and the first 40 years of the 17th century were particularly difficult almost everywhere. This was the culmination of the population growth, the crisis of high prices, a deterioration of purchasing power, and the maintenance, the development of a discipline as it were, to resist that was a sign of one's maybe not one's godliness, but certainly one's respectability and belonging to this larger community. There were certain things that were expected of you to be a member of that community, and this industriousness was an outward sign of it. But this gets me back to my sort of statement I made about that graph of rising labor force, the lengthening work year. At a certain point, this shifts to a desire for respectability that becomes a little more secular. You might say it's leading us from the confessionalization to early enlightenment, some kind of, I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable in bandying these terms about, but there's something going on that is secularizing concepts that had one function in one period and then to take on another a little later on. And after the middle of the 17th century, this respectability takes the form of a wide range of new consumer goods that are appropriate to households that where in an earlier period they would have been signs of luxury and of moral weakness. They become signs of respectability. And so it's that shift that I'm particularly interested in, and that continues on into the deep into the 18th century. This is the era, you might say, in my view, of this industrious revolution. So my main point is that it begins with things that are common to Asia and Europe, but in the period of the crisis of the 17th century, it takes on a new mission, a new function, and it has a lot to do with this shift from coercion to incentive, this internalization of what in the Enlightenment comes to be called betterment and improvement, which are terms then that in an interesting book by Paul Slack suddenly become voluminous, found in the literature all over where they had been absent before, somewhere in the 1670s and 80s. And one can find comparable language in other European countries, particularly in Holland and Germany. Wow.
I actually have a question. I'm curious to what extent, and to come back to the question of the household, to what extent does the Little Divergence, with it, this industrious revolution, does it depend on a particular structure or model of the household, the family? That is a family structure where you have relatively late dates of marriage, so children remain in the household for relatively long periods of time, where you might have other relatives living, versus a more fluid model of the household where people are moving around much more.
Well, I think that's important, and again, it takes me a little bit out of my comfort zone, but on the other hand, I did, in the introduction to my book on the Industrial Revolution, I tried to argue why this was particularly characteristic of Northwestern Europe and less so elsewhere. You could find it in some urban environments, but in general, it was most intensely found in Northwestern Europe. I argued that there were certain features that were, if not absolutely necessary, were highly conducive to this kind of behavior. That is, it's one thing to say, oh, I want to be respectable and consume coffee, but if you live in a landlocked area with no cities and high transportation costs, where there's a thin market structure, you won't easily have access to that. And if you live in a household structure in which is a complex household structure in which there are multiple claimants to the resources of the household, your ability to make your own decision about consuming coffee is going to be highly constrained. So household structure, the general I say, minimal level of I say, urban and transportation infrastructure and access to trade goods, and of you know, reasonably low-cost marketing and retailing and distribution. All of these are, you might say, are preconditions. The more nuclear the household, the more it has the flexibility to move in these directions without you know, the senior members of the household saying, no, that's not how it's never been done, or you owe your uncles before you you know, this or that before you can consider these luxury goods. That would be you know, the wrong priority. So a lot, I think, has to do with that structure. I could only sort of make that general claim. Once I did that in the book, and there were certainly people who then argued, well, no, it's a much more general concept, it's not confined to this area. There have been studies done, say, of consumer behavior in one student I worked with in Spain, in the area around Murcia facing the Mediterranean in the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, there were all sorts of blue goods available, but their ability, the ability of them to spread and develop and become common and accepted was a very painful, difficult process. It usually confined itself to small sort of subgroups of the population. There were religious, political constraints, as well as simply the economic means to acquire these goods. It just didn't take off. And so I think this combination of factors that I mentioned really is relevant. Something like that happens even in Norway, where there's another student working on goods entering into the fjords of Norway and being distributed by farmers into the countryside. The Danish state, which in the 17th and 18th centuries controls Norway, was so controlling in its except, I mean, there was always smuggling, but that occurred at such a high price and with such a high transport cost that again, these things didn't really take off until a much later date. So it took special circumstances. Among them, household structure, but it took a confluence of several factors.
Time for maybe one more question.
Well, just a quick point about this brings in trade.
Yeah.
And what is being traded? And we already introduced coffee,
Yeah.
tea, sugar, tobacco.
Yeah.
All these colonies, which you're dismissing as useless, are injecting
Yeah.
drugs into the amenable.
Yeah.
The amenable are nuclear households in the kind of boiling, emerging, boiling, kind of expanding commercial zones where there are no barriers.
Yeah.
So trade does play a role, and Dan Schmal's kind of biohistory plays a role here. I think that these households are getting injected with these alien commodities, which we will call drugs.
All right, so I'm just saying that they have an incentive to respectability, and you're saying these pathetic people are hooked on.
I'm not saying they're pathetic. I think they're very interesting. I'm just saying
seriously,
we're adding onto the, add a layer onto that, which is you're saying that the Danes and the Spanish imposed barriers, like James I barrier, tobacco is a foul and horrible thing, we will not have it. But something about these worlds, the trade is playing a role.
trade is playing a role, but this is my opportunity. Because I'm kind of worried about this when I was early on in this stage. I thought, well, is this really just a trade story? Northwestern Europe perhaps is on the sea, it has ports, you know, it's bound to be different than, you know, someplace in central Austria, right? And so, my current research project is on a very prosaic and very typically European commodity, which is bread. Now, people ate bread from the Middle Ages and up to, you know, they do still eat bread, right? And so you might say, well, this can't be a dynamic story. This can't be part of the Industrial Revolution story. Bread is the staff of life. People have to eat some bread. It's what's going on. But between 1650 and 1850, there was a wheat revolution in much of Europe, particularly of Northwest Europe. southern England, northern France, the Low Countries, switched from a mixture of, well, there was some wheat bread, of course, but there was rye bread. There were people tried to make bread of barley and oats. They typically used these for boiled, for pottage and porridges and pancakes, a whole variety of, I say, bread substitutes. Moreover, you can have bread that is simple, coarse bread, what we would call wholesome whole wheat bread, or you can have refined white bread, like Wonder Bread. I thought a big Wonder Bread sign was it an illusion? I was a bit groggy. I thought, gee, is there still Wonder Bread? I knew there was a sign. So between 1650 and 1850, there's an enormous shift away from all these subsidiary and lesser grains and the coarser grains toward fine wheat bread, until it becomes the dominant bread. That refined white bread costs much more, pound per pound, calorie per calorie, than what was substituted. This is where part of not a small part of this, because that was the largest expenditure of most ordinary households. This was where a lot of this industriousness was focused on. So yes, there was tea and coffee and all the rest, but there was something no more prosaic than bread. And among beverages, Richard here, Eintema, is with us. He's been working for years on the study of brewing, and then he's moved in. Perhaps his interests have shifted to distilling. There were shifts in these beverages, more sort of away from beer toward distilled beverages, and we find that in much of northwestern Europe as well. I'm not sure exactly how these costs compared, but these are all more marketed goods. That is, you went to the baker and you had to buy the distilled beverages rather than home brewing and home baking. And they required, I say, cash on the barrelhead, or at least cash periodically to make these payments. And they were stimulants to this industriousness. It was a more comprehensive process than simply the sort of the spectacular things that we think of right off the bat of exotic non-Western groceries.
Okay, I'm going to cut it here because I know you have another gig after this. Thank you so much.